Patent Number, S09256008 Supervisor, Dr. M.S. Newton Second Reader, Drive E.J. Van Leeuwen Word Count, 16.017 Ma Thesis Literary Studies, English Literature March 8, 2015. 1. Contents Introduction. 2. Chapter 1, The Afterlife of Sherlock Holmes. 5. 1.1 Introduction. 5. 1.2 The Central Character. 6. 1.3a, Post, Modernist Approach, 11. 1.4 Conclusion. 13. Chapter 2, The BBC Series Sherlock, 15. 2.1 Introduction, 15. 2.3 Updated Cases. 19. 2.4 Updated Themes and Characters. 27. 2.5 Conclusion, 30. Chapter 3, A 21st Century Fan Base. 32. 3.1 Introduction. 32. 3.2 Reception of the Adaptation. 33. 3.3 Online Identity. 36. 3.4 Conclusion, 40 Conclusion. 41 Works cited, 44. 2. Introduction. When creating his main character, Arthur Conan Doyle could never have foreseen that decades later the detective stories of Sherlock Holmes would still evoke such strong reactions. Although Sherlock Holmes has indeed been a commercial success over the past 130 years, as a fictional creation, Conan Doyle has had his difficulties dealing with his tremendous popularity. The 19th century audience already practically forced the author to bring his character back from the dead. Since then, Sherlock Holmes' audience and their cultural context obviously have changed dramatically. Technological advances are not the least important influences in altering the original detective stories. From the 1900s onwards, many film adaptations have been produced, all trying to adjust the detective's image in such a way that it would fit in its current setting. The most recent adaptations are the Sherlock Holmes movies starring Robert Downey Jr. as Holmes and Jude Law as Watson, and the BBC series Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman. Both have again reached millions of fans worldwide, resulting in a growing demand for new episodes. With that comes a second technological development, the Internet, where an enormous fan base has been formed and the character Sherlock Holmes has found an online identity of its own. Apart from examining the statistics and numbers that indicate its popularity, this thesis will investigate the developments in British television that have supported the reinvention of the character of Sherlock Holmes. I shall argue that new technologies have not only transformed the nature of the famous Holmesian method in the series itself, but have also created a new online environment that has fundamentally altered the relationship of the fans to the character and to the process of detection itself. In this thesis, the main focus lies on the BBC series Sherlock, a show that may be understood as quality television. Quality television is, according to Lynn Thomas, based upon two terms, namely audience size and its cultural iconic status, 2, these being the constitutive elements in her understanding of quality television as an aesthetic category. What is different in the case of Sherlock, is that the character of Sherlock Holmes already was a deep-rooted cultural icon in British culture when the broadcasting network BBC aired the 2010 series. The 3 series should, due to its popularity and its use of Holmes as an icon of British heroism, be seen as part of the genre category quality television, as Ashley Polasek suggests. Polasek explains that by employing the term as a genre category, it implies that the series is cinematic in nature and linked to cult television, 393. This last comparison may seem contradictory to Thomas's definition of quality television, as a cult typically suggests a small audience of clever and hip people, while Sherlock knows an extensive and varied fan audience. The series belongs to contemporary British popular culture, but does so based upon an understanding of its history, one that is merely updated to our modern standards. It is, therefore, of importance to understand its place in the mainstream in relation to the dominant culture when investigating the origins of the series' popularity. By creating a 21st century variant of Sherlock Holmes, Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat actually were writing to fulfill a need for a new man for a new age. Pour 4. In line with this statement, Peter Brooks stresses that Conan Doyle created a knowable world, one which knows certain laws of society that are recognizable by the audience. Gatiss and Moffat created a world which was very much alike the world our generation is living in today, which includes not only technological devices but also updated social laws and conventions. However, at times the stories also trespasses this world and hints at futuristic possibilities like nuclear testing in The Hound of the Baskervilles and robot-like characters with inexhaustible memories like Dr. Magnuson in His Last Vow. Although additions like these have made the directors the holders of the cards instead of Conan Doyle, the stories all depend heavily on the original stories. Some elements of the stories were combined and sometimes a direct parallel is present. Compare A Study in Scarlet to A Study in Pink and A Scandal in Bohemia to A Scandal in Belgravia. In order to do critical justice to both the original stories but mainly to Gatiss and Moffat's adaptation, various aspects of the BBC adaptation will be investigated in this thesis. To begin with, Chapter 1 will address the cultural and historical context of Sherlock Holmes' afterlife, including a thorough reflection on the main character and a postmodernist interpretation of the series itself and the series' main characters. Next, Chapter 2 will 4. Investigate earlier adaptations and the BBC's role in broadcasting new versions of the original stories. This chapter will then give an understanding of the updated cases through an in-depth analysis of each episode with emphasis on the technological advances throughout the stories. Also, Sherlock's revamped and newly found characters will be discussed here in context of the episodes. Finally, Chapter 3 will summarize the various fan bases that the series have brought to life and addresses the effects the original Sherlock Holmes stories have experienced from yet another successful adaptation. 5. Chapter 1, The Afterlife of Sherlock Holmes. 1.1 Introduction. The original stories of Arthur Conan Doyle have been reworked in many adaptations, both in print and in film. Not all of these adaptations stuck to Conan Doyle's interest in pure detection and the creation of original crime drama. Just taking shifts in the character of Sherlock Holmes on television as a starting point reveals many interesting developments. The character of Sherlock on screen has come a long way, as he was actually the first fictional character adapted for television, Gib Erman 2079. Two of the latest film adaptations, Guy Ritchie's 2009 and 2011 films Sherlock Holmes and Sherlock Holmes, A Game of Shadows, have shown that characteristics that are more in line with those of an action-adventure character can be very successful. The original genre of the detective story is here somewhat lost, so in order to understand how the BBC Sherlock series have retained its style, W. H. Auden's classic exploration of the detective story may be used as a starting point. Auden has a clear, but perhaps limited definition of what a detective does, which may be used to understand the opposing technique the 2010 character of Sherlock Holmes uses. According to Auden, in the detective story the audience does not know the truth at all, one of the actors, the murderer, does, and the detective, of his own free will, discovers and reveals what the murderer, of his own free will, tries to conceal. 148. In essence, the 2010 Sherlock Holmes is still based on this definition, but a demanding audience and advances in technology have given a new dimension to the genre as such. The detective stories of Sherlock Holmes and its characters have had a cult status from the original Conan Doyle stories onwards. Still, some critics argue that in his own time, Conan Doyle was not given enough credit for his works, while at the same time his works were a huge commercial success. In its opening line, the documentary Unlocking Sherlock introduces the 2010 series as a 21st century masterpiece based on a 19th century phenomenon, 2419, which implies that the 21st century audience does recognize the original story's strength. Still, the adaptations altered not only the original 6 stories, but also its characters, resulting in a typical Sherlock Holmes character for every generation. Because of the large amount of adaptations and their various alterations, the present-day audience may have a different take on the original stories. But in order to picture the original Sherlock Holmes as Arthur Conan Doyle envisioned him, we can only depend on his opinion of the cinematic versions that he himself saw. Due to his positive feedback on the version that E.L. Norwood acted out, This may be seen as the classic version of the on-screen Sherlock Holmes. The adaptations that followed Norwood's may be described as the ghosts of that particular Holmes character, so in order to find out how the 2010 version of Sherlock Holmes became so popular by its audience, the character himself should be studied first. 1.2 The central character. If someone had mentioned the name Holmes the last 130 years or so, one would probably associate it with the hero that Arthur Conan Doyle brought to life for his stories. The first name prominence of Sherlock in the BBC series Sherlock is a rather interesting contrast to Dr. Watson, who we know both by his first and last name. Where in previous adaptations Sherlock Holmes was addressed most often by his last name, the name of the series is now so closely tied to its main character that our present-day audience knows him rather by his first name. In the series itself, Sherlock is only sporadically called Mr. Holmes, which even leads to confusion in The Empty Hearse when Mrs. Hudson addressed both Mycroft and Sherlock by that name. Zooming in on the man behind the character, ironically enough, Benedict Cumberbatch's own name is rather extraordinary as well. Cumberbatch, son of actors Wanda Ventham and Timothy Carlton, birth name, Timothy Carlton Cumberbatch, seemed to have gained his fame rather promptly as he has had a very rapid rise in the first decade of the new century, McFarlane 174. Not only was his professional work noticed, his rather extraordinary vision in real life was interesting as well as he is tall and pleasant looking enough, with an engaging ordinariness, 174. The latter added to his acting skills which made him strikingly in some very high-profile films, 174. Still, his physical appearance is 7 far from ordinary, which makes McFarlane's statement rather paradoxical. Cumberbatch's true attractiveness is not based upon a standardized look but rather upon the unusualness of his face, which is what makes him an intriguing figure for his fan audience. On top of that, like his on-screen persona, his somewhat unwieldy name has hardly been a hindrance, 174, as it has actually been beneficial to his fame. In the series, Sherlock calls himself a consulting detective, very much in line with the typically popular consulting services of any type offered professionally over the past couple of decades. This may, therefore, seem a modern title, but the true parallel is already found in the original stories. Sherlock Holmes' home is namely located near the area of Harley Street, the place where consulting physicians were situated during that time and even some still today. Next to that, both in the original stories and the 2010 series, Sherlock is, in contrast to the police at Scotland Yard, an amateur, Auden 156. Still, the audience holds Sherlock to be the actual expert as he proves to be so much smarter than the professionals. Evidently, his work is still what Holmes is living for, as it keeps him from being bored and having a relapse into smoking cigarettes and using drugs, another parallel to the original stories. In the early stories, Holmes was addicted to cocaine, a drug that was used to fight his boredom. In the 2010 series, his addictive state is hinted at several times, although his actual drug addiction is not mentioned explicitly until the third episode of Series 3, His Last Vow. Sherlock is addicted to smoking. But he is trying to overcome this addiction by using nicotine patches. Sherlock needs these patches in order to concentrate on the cases that he consults, which sometimes results in a need for a second nicotine patch when a case is harder to solve. This example is a direct reference to the two-pipe puzzles which Sherlock mentions in Conan Doyle's original tales. Even when he does not use these nicotine patches, he always seems to be very energetic and enthusiastic about his cases. As a result of this behavior, Ashley Palasek voices the opinion that Sherlock is the anti-hero or even child prodigy, 387, of the series. The child prodigy may indeed be explained through his unstoppable flow of energy, the ignoring of authority, the police, and the fact that he always has an answer whenever he is being criticized. I do not completely agree with Palasek here, as Sherlock is 8 definitely the hero of the series and Moriarty seems to be the typical villain. Still, these classifications may be a bit too extreme as well, as the Sherlock Holmes of the 2010 BBC series is definitely dependent on others in maintaining his status as a hero. Next to that, Moriarty can be seen to be a double for Sherlock, using the similarities between them to eventually overthrow the great detective. Still, the character of Sherlock Holmes in Sherlock is not a typically likable hero. In fact, his popularity only grows when the media is positive about him. As is shown throughout the series, the media is, however, of great importance as Sherlock thus reaches an audience of ordinary Londoners. In fact, the people of London may be seen as a representation of the fan audience off-screen. As Sherlock seems uncomfortable in situations in which his fans show their admiration, his malfunctioning in social situations is again underlined. His attitude towards the outside world is indeed often mistaken for arrogance, which contrasts with Dr. Watson, whose overall attitude is one of humility. Watson is often the one who helps Sherlock out in challenging social situations, but at times even Watson gets annoyed by Holmes' overconfidence, which results in calling him a show-off. Sherlock's success eventually rebounds on him, and in the Reichenbach fall, albeit with the help of Moriarty, Sherlock's reputation crumbles. Sergeant Sally Donovan is most outspoken in her disapproval of Sherlock Holmes and tries to warn Watson not to associate with the detective in the first episode, A Study in Pink already. Her main reason for doing so is that she regards him as a freak without any colleagues or friends, as Sherlock doesn't have friends. 32:22. Donovan calls Holmes a psychopath, while critics like Bran Nicole have argued that the Sherlock Holmes in the BBC series have more in common with a sociopath. The antisocial behavior that Sherlock displays indeed underlines this point of view. The emotional responses to cases are provided by Watson, who repeatedly confronts Sherlock with his lack of sympathy. The human aspect of Holmes is an important element in A Scandal in Belgravia, as Watson also writes on his blog about the unsolved cases, which are not specifically mentioned. Sherlock does not want Watson to write about these cases, but Watson stresses that people want to know your 9 Human, 716, which could be a direct reference to the audience of the series, and not only to the blog's readers. In the Sherlock series, the motive of boredom still exists and is partly satisfied with the character of Moriarty, who, as mentioned before, in a way acts as a double for Sherlock. In episode 3 of season 1, The Great Game, Sherlock's enemy stresses they were made for each other. Sherlock not only needs his work in order to overcome his boredom, it also helps to build his character as a more modern one. This could be interpreted by him stressing that he lives for his work, a common trait of a workaholic. Sherlock thus requires Moriarty as he provides new cases for him to solve, but Moriarty in return also needs Sherlock to solve cases for him, as for example in The Scandal of Belgravia, where he uses Irene Adler to solve the key code. This interdependence between the hero and anti-hero blurs the lines of the good and the bad even more, which feeds the struggle of Sherlock trying to do the good thing throughout the series. Another relationship which is discussed at length by fan audiences is the one between Sherlock and Watson. Their relationship is indeed an important part of the character's development in the series. To begin with, the biggest difference between Sherlock and earlier adaptations, when considering the outward appearances of both Watson and Holmes, is their overall groomed looks. As Benjamin Poore points out, their dress could be explained by stating they are both metrosexual, 10, men. Sherlock does indeed resemble a metrosexual man, to which Benedict Cumberbatch's own physical appearance adds that he looks very groomed. In a way, Sherlock does not seem to realize that his appearance is so appealing, which adds to his attractiveness. Watson, on the other hand, looks much less polished, and has more in common with an ordinary man, which contradicts Poore's statement. As both characters are different in this point, another statement by Poore may be more interesting. Their close friendship may be explained with another contemporary concept, namely that of a bromance, 10. This interpretation is on the one hand very modern, as it is a term used often in present-day society, but may on the other hand also be seen as the exact opposite, as it rejects the possibility of a homosexual relationship altogether. The creators of Sherlock are 10 Not explicit in their main character's sexual orientation, but Watson is at least acting as if he is heterosexual as he dates women and even marries one. Still, their friendship is easily confused with a homosexual relationship, as Mrs. Hudson does so at various points in the series. In all, the outward appearance of Sherlock is no real evidence for describing Sherlock and Watson's relationship as homosexual, and the hype has mainly been instigated by fans that tried to deduce hints about the characters' desire for each other from any detail they could find in the episodes. Sherlock Holmes critic Bran Nicole and various characters in the series itself have argued that the 2010 Sherlock Holmes virtually impersonates a machine, or more precisely, a computer, Nicole 132, of which Holmes calls his brains his own hard drive, the great game. The mind palace that Sherlock helps solve his cases is indeed in its size, speed, and accessibility comparable to the way in which a hard drive functions. Sherlock Holmes' analytical manner of finding hints and clues also adds to this comparison, while his science of deduction, or his particular way of doing his job, is not a new development. However, the comparison to a computer is a new addition and works very well in our 21st century setting. Not only is Sherlock's brain working like a machine, also his social skills are affected. Nicole even argues that emotions for Sherlock are what viruses are to computers, a threat, 134, to the functioning of the machine. In all, the episodes have shown that the most important objective the creators had to keep in mind was to a certain extent retaining the original stories while keeping their additions relevant in the process of what Polasek calls contemporization, 390. Sherlock himself may seem a bit out of place in his own environment regarding his physical appearance and his social awkwardness. Nevertheless, one example that shows that at least his creators are very much aware of his surroundings as he first uses a BlackBerry which he exchanges in due course for an iPhone. Sherlock is also seen using an Apple Mac, although this is Watson's laptop and not his own. 11.1.3a, Post-modernist approach. Many critics have underlined the postmodern characteristics of the series Sherlock. This section will investigate a few elements that are of importance in this thesis context, such as the invention of film and theories relating to Sherlock's mental state. The first films appeared not long after Conan Doyle got his Sherlock Holmes stories published. This resulted in many adaptations of the stories which show all the stages of development that the medium went through, from silent movies to television and online on-demand access. Strikingly, television, unlike architecture, literature, or painting, never had a modernist phase that could serve as a point of departure for postmodern television, Collins 330-331, which may ideally lead to insights into the relations of technology in temporary cultures, 327. The emergence of postmodernism is, therefore, an uneven development. Its appearance and eventual impact vary from one medium to another, 331. Next to the postmodern interpretation of the medium of film and television as a whole, critics have also read postmodern elements into the series Sherlock itself. The use of film was the most crucial transformation in adapting the tales of Conan Doyle, as the medium was a very modern development and was introduced only a few years after the original Sherlock Holmes stories were published. Not only has the use of film made the detective stories even more alive centuries later, it has given its main character, Sherlock Holmes, a cult status. The art of film, therefore, has influenced the reaction of the audience on the stories in their original form. In his essay The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, cultural critic Walter Benjamin argues that art has always been reproducible, although some elements change when a replica is made. The development of the original Conan Doyle stories all the way up to the 2010 BBC series more than 100 years later may indeed be described as one such replica as Benjamin describes it. Benjamin understands that the impact of film on the audience is so great that it captures a place of its own among the artistic processes, 570. Moreover, the series Sherlock stretches beyond the characteristics of a replica, as it has not only altered elements but also added several, of which the technological details are the most obvious. 12 Many adaptations of the stories have been produced since the invention of film, but one of the most recent series that was made by the BBC for the medium of television, has done so extremely successfully. The mass public, as described by Benjamin, was reached, and their enthusiasm towards the original works of art by Conan Doyle has grown since the series' release. As Benjamin points out, even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art is lacking in one element: its presence in time and space, its unique existence at the place where it happens to be. 571. Indeed, the concept of authenticity, 571, is part of the analysis of a reproduction of the original, as new creators may have the original concept in mind when writing the adaptation, but can never fully grasp its meaning. Many elements play a role in this theory, as not only the audiences change, but also their social rules and laws and technology advance. One characteristic of the BBC series which shows these above-mentioned changes is its enormous amount of online content. As part of popular culture, Sherlock Holmes has given the audience a proactive reaction by creating fan clubs offline, but mainly online. The response of the masses is controlled very easily online, which is, in turn, one of the reasons for the broad reach of the series. Another reason for the series' success could be the fact that, according to Benjamin, the conventional is uncritically enjoyed, 571, which may give the BBC series, or any other adaptation really, a step ahead from other series and films. Not only was the character of Sherlock Holmes well known before the series aired, also the broadcasting network BBC already had a very prominent place in British culture. Still, it is not entirely clear whether the original works, the novels and stories, have also benefited from the success of the series, as the adaptation does not only have similarities but obviously also differs from the original. Therefore, one may state that the tradition of Sherlock Holmes has changed so greatly that the BBC series Sherlock has become a separate, though derivative element of modern culture, which, although it benefits from the well-known institutions of Sherlock Holmes and the BBC, is also successful individually. In his essay, Bran Nicole argues that the Sherlock Holmes created by the series writers is in fact the symptom of the postmodern age of production. 134. There are indeed various 13 instances in the series that underline his statement. One such element is found in Sherlock's character and relates to his lack of emotions. As mentioned before in section 1.2, this is most prominently seen at moments when Sherlock reacts inappropriately enthusiastic when he is working on cases and bystanders show their revolt of his reactions. According to Frederick Jameson, the world of crime narratives in postmodernity is indeed one in which the waning of affect occurs repeatedly. 61. As Bran Nicole explains, Sherlock shows signs of postmodern sensibility. 138, which is most prominently found in his mood swings. When Sherlock is not working on a case, his mind is not challenged and he seeks distraction in other activities such as using drugs. Apart from the development of the original works into the BBC series, the individual character of Sherlock as created by Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat may also be investigated with a modernist approach in mind. The main problem that Sherlock encounters when doing his job is that he cannot restrain himself from being enthusiastic about horrible facts and his ability to deduce the missing links in the cases. The works of one of the most influential psychoanalysts of the 20th century, Sigmund Freud, may usefully be brought in here. His definition of epistemophilia, or the satisfaction derived from reaching the conclusion of a line of thought, 124, may be used to describe Holmes' unorthodox reaction when he is deducing and solving a case. The term also includes that the experience is so intense that it may be felt as a sexual satisfaction. 124, which in turn would make up for the rather unromantic life he is living. This explanation could satisfy the void that Sherlock leaves with the 21st century audience's understanding of the character, who is at times rather difficult to relate to. 1.4 Conclusion. In all, the history of Sherlock Holmes' afterlife is extensive and knows many adaptations and changes. The original character of Holmes is rather difficult to trace back in Sherlock, but following the reactions on earlier adaptations of its creator Conan Doyle, an estimated ideal version of Holmes may be identified. Other variants of the character will be discussed. 14 Hereafter in Chapter 2. But from the character analysis in this chapter, it has already become evident that the BBC adaptation is unique in its approach when compared with earlier adaptations of the Holmes stories. To trace back where its popularity comes from, we have to understand the adaptation's place in history. The invention of film has provided a medium in which the stories can be retold many times. Benjamin's theory of art in the age of mechanical reproduction has in turn shown us the importance of tracing back the impact of film, or in this case of television, on its public. Also his explanation of the difference between authenticity and the creator's objective but eventual inability to stick to the original works adds to our understanding to what extent Sherlock may be seen as a successful adaptation of the original works of Conan Doyle. The influence of postmodernity accounts for the characteristic of the method of working that is so typical of Sherlock Holmes as a detective. In order to give a thorough understanding of the series' influence, Chapter 2 and 3 will investigate the BBC's history and objective and the series' influence and impact on the present-day audience. 15 Chapter 2, the BBC series Sherlock 2.1 Introduction. On July 25, 2010, the BBC aired the first episode of Sherlock, a series which has developed into 3 series, each consisting of 3 episodes. Each episode explores and solves one particular case while at the same time other events link up the stories and form the series arc. The main characters of the series, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson, are played by Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman, 2 British actors with many other successful films and series on their resume. Also the series creators, Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat, have a broad experience in producing television. First coming to the public's attention as part of the League of Gentlemen, 1999 to 2002, Gatiss is a comedian and novelist who also plays the part of Mycroft Holmes, Sherlock's brother. He has also scripted several episodes of Doctor Who, 2005 present, as well as a version of M.R. James's The Tractate Middoth, 2013, among other works. Before his work on Sherlock, Moffat was known for his work on the comedy series Coupling, 2000 to 2004, and more recently, as a writer and later showrunner on the televised Doctor Who. Both men have their roots in comedy, and comic elements play a large part in Sherlock as well. The series have attracted casual viewers but also fans of the original tales who have obviously compared these two next to earlier adaptations. The difference between these two kinds of viewers is accommodated for by the creators who have added in jokes and references to the original stories. One critic, Ashley Polasek, puts the series in context aligned to other 21st century adaptations such as the Guy Ritchie movies and the Fox series House. Although this thesis focuses on Sherlock, her work may add to understanding what adaptations may lead to. According to Linda Hutchin, an adaptation is an announced and extensive transposition of a particular work or works. 7. As the BBC series also differ from the original stories, the comparison of the two and other adaptations will be conducted with this definition in mind. 16. 2.2 The BBC series The British Broadcasting Corporation has been a national institution from the 1920s onwards, making it the oldest public broadcasting corporation worldwide. It functions as a deep-rooted and respected institution both in the United Kingdom as well as abroad. Like many long-standing institutions, the BBC has had to deal with shifting social needs, cultural tastes, and more pragmatic imperatives, Blumler 330, which have doubtlessly influenced its choices regarding the programs it makes. As J. Blumler already described, series like Sherlock were produced in times in which PRS years of change on British broadcasting were far-reaching, challenging, and continuous, Blumler 330. One element which always needs to be fulfilled is the ideal of public service, which however was nowhere explicitly defined, 330, but may be explained in terms of programming range, quality, and popularity, 330. Lord Reith was the instigator of this concept of public service, as he declared at a meeting with the general manager of the BBC that he was of opinion that broadcasting should be conducted as a public service, ODNB. As he was then a very young chief executive and the BBC was a commercial enterprise, it was a bold statement, but he was also very successful because of it. Indeed, the change did not happen immediately, but in 1926 the BBC turned into a public corporation, ODNB. Reith then became BBC's first Director General and was even honoured with a knighthood. The emphasis here lies on the general viewing audience, Blumler 330, a concept that prohibits programs and series being targeted at a particular audience. In Sherlock these criteria are met, as the series have not only satisfied earlier fans of the Sherlock Holmes stories but also created an audience which was not that familiar with the character and his cases. Still, there are various examples to be found on television today of shows that are indeed very specialized in terms of subject matter and are clearly aimed at a niche audience. The strength of Sherlock is, therefore, even more remarkable, as it seems there is hardly any gender or age exclusion in the fan audience. As J. Blumler concludes in his Encyclopedia of Television, British television has been extensively revamped since the 1980s 336. Still, what he could not have predicted. 17 Back in 2004 was the ongoing, or rather intensifying, of the influence of new technologies. The most explicit statement from his conclusion, which is applicable to the present-day situation, is that British broadcasting was becoming less closely regulated than it used to be, Blumler 336. The main evidence for this development is that the Sherlock series can be watched online, both on websites of the BBC and on pay-to-view online services. The BBC is thus straining to be its past self, 336, but also adding extra online services on their website, which it probably is required to do in order to survive in our present-day online-oriented society. Nevertheless, the technological advances have caused a modification in executing the network's programs and has widened its scope. The accessibility has grown immensely by offering the BBC series on paid platforms such as Netflix. The quality of Netflix has convinced a great number of people worldwide to subscribe, which gave them access to an online video library. An estimated 61.4 million people are currently subscribers to Netflix, Gensler. Regarding Holmes, many literary adaptations have appeared since Arthur Conan Doyle created the original stories in 1889. However, it was not until 1951 when the first television series of the Sherlock Holmes adventures was produced in the United Kingdom by Van Dyke Pictures, Gib Erman for 2080. Unfortunately, the pilot of the series was not successful and only one episode was broadcast. Already a few months later the British Broadcasting Company aired its own pilot, 2080, and by the end of 1951 the BBC produced the first complete television series of Sherlock Holmes adventures. Apparently this version was successful and the BBC continued to produce series of Holmes adventures, 2080. A 1965 series of 12 adaptations was produced by David Goddard which attracted 11 million viewers. As noted by The Times, the sleuth played by Douglas Wilmer bore an uncanny resemblance, 2080, to the original Holmes. It probably meant that the actor looked a lot like the image that the audience had of Holmes, an image that was created in large part by Sidney Paget, who drew illustrations for the Strand magazine, in which the first Conan Doyle stories were published. It was not until 1998 that BBC Radio became the first production company to complete dramatizations of all 60 Sherlock Holmes adventures, 2081. 18. There were of course also many other actors that played the role of Sherlock Holmes and were applauded for their work during their own time, of whom a few will be named here to illustrate the background material of Sherlock's producers. In the 1930s and 1940s, Basil Rathbone was one of the most famous impersonators of Sherlock Holmes, in a series of films that began with his performance of Sherlock Holmes in The Hound of the Baskervilles, 1938. This version was very successful, which led to a sequel, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, 1939. After a 3-year pause, another 12 films followed in 5 years, ODNB. The adaptations bore increasingly less resemblance to the original Doyle stories as they used historically significant elements such as the Nazis. The first true Sherlock Holmes for the televised generation was Peter Cushing, who showed yet another side of the Sherlock Holmes character in The Hound of the Baskervilles, 1959, and, through his work for Hammer Studios, he was the unmistakable horror actor of his time. The Sherlock Holmes of the late 1960s was played by Robert Stevens in Billy Wilder's The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, 1969, a film adaptation that was even further removed from the original stories as it included such implausible figures as a troop of dwarfs and the Loch Ness Monster. By that time Stevens was experiencing glorious success, ODNB, particularly in the London theatre, and was, for example, the star performer in The Royal Hunt of the Sun, 1964. Jeremy Brett played the leading role in the series The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes from 1984 to 1994. In the 2004 TV film adaptation Sherlock Holmes and the Case of the Silk Stocking, Rupert Everett played a queer version of the Sherlock Holmes character. In the latest adaptation Elementary, 2012 to 2015, Johnny Lee Miller plays Holmes and Lucy Liu is the first female version of Watson. Although the BBC was the initiator of the 2010 series, ultimately the creators were in control of its contents. Their intentions are known to us through various interviews they have given as a result of its success. In essence, Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss wanted to create an adaptation that might also have worked for its original creator Arthur Conan Doyle. In order to achieve this resemblance, they based their stories greatly on the acting of E.L. Norwood. British actor E.L. Norwood has played Sherlock in no less than 47 silent films, and 19 as mentioned already in section 1.1, and underlined by Brian McFarlane. He was praised by Doyle for his wonderful impersonation of Holmes, 700. Indeed, Conan Doyle thought he that rare quality which see old only be described as glamour, 562. Although every generation has produced its definitive Sherlock Holmes, 700, E.L. Norwood is identified as one of the best impersonators of the character of all time. By creating the 2010 character of Sherlock Holmes, Gatiss and Moffat gave our generation's Benedict Cumberbatch as the true Holmes impersonator. As Moffat and Gatiss explain in the documentary Unlocking Sherlock, 2014, they tried to use elements from the E.L. Norwood adaptations in the 2010 Sherlock series. Creator Stephen Moffat knew exactly what he wanted to achieve with his television adaptation of the original stories, as he states on the BBC site that the series is about brilliant detection, dreadful villains, and blood-curdling crimes. He got rid of the details that were added by later adaptations, as Conan Doyle's stories were never about frock coats and gaslight, BBC site. The real difference between the Sherlock Holmes tales and other detective is, in his opinion, simple. Other detectives have cases, Sherlock Holmes has adventures, and that's what matters. BBC site, 2.3 Updated cases. The BBC series Sherlock were produced nearly 130 years after Arthur Conan Doyle published his first novel, and the adaptations that were made throughout these years have redefined the stories tremendously. The producers of the BBC series have had the difficult task of recreating an adaptation that would appeal a 21st century audience. Although the number of adaptations on Sherlock Holmes is enormous, the demand for new stories is still present, as many new variants of the stories are repeatedly very popular. As shown above, Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat had a strong vision of what their version of the Sherlock Holmes stories should be. Moffat pointed out to Ashley Polasek, there is a tendency, perhaps because it is a period piece, to treat it like Holy Writ, and that can sometimes suffocate the voice of the author who didn't regard it that way at all. 390. The series have thus proven to be a one-of-a-kind adaptation containing many sensible details, as will be discussed in detail. 20 hereafter. Obviously, at times when technology is woven into our daily lives as greatly as it is now, it is no surprise that creators Moffat and Gatiss have integrated all kinds of modern gadgets in their stories. The integrating of technological elements is done very successfully, as the audience is really absorbed into the series as they are invited to help solve the cases. This starts in the first episode already, as hints are projected on the screen, so that the audience is actively included in the search for the solution to the cases. This actually makes the stories more realistic as the more unlikely facts are explained, and it seems as if an ordinary observant person is nonetheless just not trained enough to see what Sherlock deduces. The 2010 series is not only updated with technological advances but also had to have a different set of standards to satisfy the 21st century's audience needs. As Poor explains, the Victorian audience expected and thrived on melodrama, 3, while, according to Ira Hauptmann, the modern audience need a realism's morality, 283. The methods of deduction employed by Sherlock in the BBC series have not changed that much from the original that were based on the techniques of Joseph Bell. The fact that his science of deduction has become Sherlock's trademark and that Joseph Bell's work was already quite modern for his times, makes it not very surprising that the creators preserved this element of the original stories intact. The first episode of Season 1, called A Study in Pink, introduces the main characters in such a way that any missing pieces, or parts of their characters that do not fit into our society today, are taken care of. For instance, Dr. Watson has just come back from the 20th century war in Afghanistan, which parallels with the original stories. The series may thus be seen as a continuation of the original, rather than a contradiction. Watson is seeing a psychiatrist for his post-traumatic stress and is encouraged to write a blog about his experiences as a soldier to overcome his fears. Eventually, Watson writes about the cases as a way of dealing with his violent past. After Sherlock has dragged Watson to his first case, he shows how he deduces information, based on Watson's mobile phone. One of the clues the phone gives him are the scratches, which implicates that the phone has been used a lot while 21. It is a new version. Sherlock thus concludes that it must have been a present from someone with the initials like the ones that are etched on its back. This scene is based on the original stories by Conan Doyle, in which Sherlock shows his deduction skills by using almost the same hints and clues, albeit from a technological gadget of that time, a watch. Sherlock's own website called The Science of Deduction is introduced as well, but is projected as something ridiculous as it covers 43 variants of tobacco ash, which implies that Sherlock does not add any interesting information to the internet. This might even hint at the fact that Sherlock does not see the importance of using the digital world at all, although this is also contradicted by his solving of this particular case. More evidence for the importance of technology and his awareness of its importance is found in Sherlock checking the weather forecast on his mobile phone in order to help him solve the case in A Study in Pink. In contrast, Sherlock's brother uses both modern and typically London elements as he tries to communicate with Watson by using the old-fashioned telephone boxes he is passing, while at the same time watching him using modern CVC cameras. In the second episode of Season 2, The Blind Banker, the modern technologically advanced world Sherlock and John live in is challenged by a historic world of codes. Holmes easily conducts that every element in their daily life is computer-generated, from the computerized cashier at the supermarket to getting money from the ATM. Still, he also remarks that this case is different. This episode proves that Sherlock is indeed very good at deciphering computerized codes, as he easily hacks John's laptop, but has difficulties with a historical and to him unknown Chinese code. As Sherlock is solving his case, he even grumbles over the fact that they used a code. Why not use email? 1534. What is of most interest here to this thesis is that reference is made to Sherlock being like a machine, albeit by using the image of a chip and pin machine. In this scene, Sherlock finds it very odd that John is so angry with the computerized cashier, and he exclaims, "You had a row with a machine." 537. In fact, this is indeed very likely, as John is arguing with Sherlock, the personified machine, at that very moment. Details of technologies of the 21st century are once more included in this episode through details as the video surveillance, the flaw in 22, the automatic security system of a bank, and using photographs on Sherlock's mobile phone as part of solving this case. In episode 3 of Season 2, The Great Game, there are not many noticeable elements of technology, but there are instances of daily current social influences such as the need to pay the bills, which makes the main characters more human. Still, car noises seem to be very prominent as well as the City of London. One remarkable scene is found when Sherlock is showing his only physical exercise, which he is performing on his rowing machine. As he is not the typically sporty type, he probably just uses his rowing machine only to pass time. Furthermore, he is again making photographs of the crime scenes with his BlackBerry, and the series arc of codes and electronic deciphering reoccurs as well. In episode 1 of season 2, A Scandal in Belgravia, many important aspects of the Sherlock character of Sherlock Holmes are revealed. In the first place, the emphasis lies on his online identity but also on his love life. In this episode, Sherlock is repeatedly put forward as a public figure, starting with a bunch of journalists awaiting him outside a crime scene. Holmes does not believe they are indeed interested in him and Watson, but as Inspector Lestrade points out, that was before he became an internet phenomenon. 737. Quite cleverly, the series writers have here found a way of alluding to one element of Sherlock's typical dress, the deer stalker that remained part of his image since actor Basil Rathbone played the part. Sherlock grabs the hat from a dressing room as he and Watson leave a crime scene. As they leave the building, Inspector Lestrade speaks very positively about the attention, stating that it's good for the public image. 747, by which he probably means the image of the police. Sherlock responds by saying, "I'm a private detective, the last thing I need is a public image." 749. Immediately following that moment, the newspaper headings state, Hatman and Robin. The web detectives, Sherlock Net Tech, Sherlock and John Blogger Detectives and Sherlock Holmes, Net Phenomenon. Some elements of technological advances are, however, even for a 21st century audience, a bit too far reached. Particularly the scene in which John visits the murder scene in the meadows has a few implausible parts. As he finds himself in the middle of nature, it is rather odd that John 23 asks for Wi-Fi. Apparently there is indeed an internet connection available, as he uses Skype to communicate the details of the case with Sherlock, who is still in London. John is then summoned back to the city, to which he travels by helicopter, which is in itself not an extraordinary way of traveling, but it is when used for a mere colleague of an amateur detective. In episode 2 of season 2, called The Hound of Baskervilles, the subject of experiments with biological weapons and genetic mutations is prominent. The parallel to the death of Sherlock Holmes in the original stories is interesting, as Sherlock is standing on top of a bunch of rocks as if standing on the cliff at various moments in the episode. This was indeed the setting, albeit in a different country during a different case, that he was murdered in the original stories. The significance of social media is addressed in this episode, as well as there is only one mention of the Hound on Twitter, which is so little that it immediately becomes suspicious. The chemical minefield with its fogs has a very sinister feel and influences the entire episode, as it becomes a story about unveiling the secrets of the town. In this episode, Sherlock also uses his mind vault, a place in his memory which might be compared to the hard drive of a computer. The influence of the media is shown through a TV interview, for which Watson calls Sherlock a show-off as Sherlock. His addictive state is shown through him sniffing cigarette smoke and a reference to the film Thank You for Smoking. The opening scene of the third episode of season 2, called The Reichenbach Fall, is set at Watson's psychologist 18 months after Sherlock died. Watson introduces the starting point of this new series with the words, "My best friend, Sherlock Holmes, is dead." 130. Some drastic events are about to unfold in this episode, of which the following scene travels back in time 18 months. The first important theme that is discussed is fame and identity, which is mainly constructed by the media. Obviously the audience of the series already know Sherlock Holmes as a literary phenomenon, but for the public in the series there never has been such a literary character. Interestingly, Sherlock's tabloid nickname is Boffin, 323, while Watson is referred to as Bachelor John Watson, 333. Watson again stresses that 24 Sherlock's character is formed by his identity as shaped by the media. Particularly his hat is not a simple deer stalker anymore, but it's a Sherlock Holmes hat, 340. Sherlock himself does not seem to understand what all this attention could lead to as he tells Watson, "It really bothers you." "I don't understand." "Why would it bother you?" 404, Watson does indeed understand the dangers and foreshadows Sherlock's eventual setback as he points out that the press will turn, they always do, 359. Watson thus accuses the media, and not Moriarty, of being responsible for Sherlock's downfall. This is the beginning of the media circus for Sherlock, as his name is constantly used in articles about Moriarty, as we see from various newspaper clippings describing him as the expert witness, 1026. Here, Sherlock is still seen as the Reichenbach hero, 1215. Sherlock himself is very clear in his opinion about journalists and the media, as becomes evident in the next scene where he is approached by a female journalist disguised as a fan. When she asks him about his alleged homosexual relationship with Watson, he tells her that she repels him. The journalist again underlines the importance of the media in creating Sherlock's identity and employment by stating, "You need me, or you're nothing," 2255. Moriarty quite cleverly deconstructs Sherlock's identity by, for instance, manipulating Watson's soft spot. He plays a freaky children's storyteller on the TV that Watson watches in a cab, who tells a story about Sir Beaustelot, 46:16, a reference to Sherlock's arrogant performance at court which irritated Watson. The second element that is important for investigating this episode, is the use of technological devices. While Moriarty cracks the codes to several major institutions in London, Sherlock is ignorant about the buzzing of his phone and thus misses the commotion. This scene again underlines Sherlock's lack of social interaction, as he is not used to getting text messages. Watson is eventually the one who is showing him what crucial information the messages hold. Sherlock's attention is eventually caught when Watson announces that he is back, 950. In this episode, Moriarty claims to possess the key code, a series of numbers that would reveal all the world's secrets. The code was also used to open the vault of the Bank of England, to open the cells at Pentonville Prison, and to break into the security system of the Tower of London. The code is crucial, and Sherlock states that he, Moriarty, has 25 got the ultimate weapon, the key code, 1 hour 4 minutes and 44 seconds. Another technological aspect in this episode is the Wi-Fi network, or a surveillance network that is closing in on us, 48:44, of all the murderers who are watching Sherlock. These villains are all looking for the key code which Sherlock is said to possess, but in the end he takes it with him to the grave. The Empty Hearse, the first episode of Season 3, is much debated about both on-screen as well as online, as it hints at various possible ways in which Sherlock has staged his own death. However, the true cause of Sherlock's death in the previous episode is still not given. Unlike the original stories, Sherlock dies a very different death, as he seemingly commits suicide. As Benedict Cumberbatch explained in the documentary Unlocking Sherlock, the scene of the character's death is a confession of failure, 245, and to Watson and the audience it's basically saying, "Step away from who you thought I once was, because I am not that," 2:47-51. As mentioned above, this has unleashed a wave of speculation online, as will be discussed further in section 3.2. The Sign of 3, the second episode of Season 3, starts with a robbery where hacking is used, as the police misleads the robbers and catches them by hacking their system in return. This scene is apparently only there to show that the police can indeed be successful without Sherlock, and that he is an obstacle for the professionals at times. In this episode, Holmes is preparing for Watson's and Mary's wedding, and as part of his preparations he has learned to fold napkins on YouTube, 30:30. John and Sherlock are manipulated by Mary in taking each other out on a new case. Watson is using the argument that his inbox is bursting, 32:03, and that they should be going back to work together. In this episode, Sherlock is presented as a humane character who could, albeit for a short time, live without his cases, and needs his friend Dr. Watson, a welcome divergence from the highly technologically advanced previous episode. The last episode of Season 3, His Last Vow, is luckily for the audience not the end of the Sherlock series. But with that fact in mind, the episode might be a little less exciting as well. Sherlock's addiction to drugs is an interesting turn in the story, as it is discussed at length. Sherlock claims that he has been working on a case at a crack house, but 26 he has definitely been using drugs as well, as Molly detects from his urine sample in her lab. In contrast to the original stories, it is not entirely clear what kind of drugs he uses, but he is definitely scolded by Dr. Watson and Molly for using it. The appraisal of modern technology, as we have spotted in earlier episodes, is somewhat downgraded again in favor of the mind and actual physical bullying by Mr. Charles August Magnuson. Magnuson's mansion Appledore is the main element which underlines the prominence of the mind instead of technology, as the myth of the vaults is crushed when Sherlock and Watson find out no such thing exists. As we might have predicted from the Reichenbach fall, computers can be hacked, and that is the reason why Magnuson works with a mind palace, just as Sherlock does. Sherlock is in this episode partly blinded by technology, as he is convinced that Magnuson wears glasses that show him all the information on a particular person when he looks at them. This is not the case, but Magnuson still has the computer-like image in his vision as if it is projected on his lenses or present within the mind itself, so the audience is kept wondering what the truth really is. When Sherlock is being sent away for murdering Magnuson, the unthinkable happens. Moriarty sends a computerized image of himself to every television screen in the country asking, "Did you miss me?" 1 hour 27 minutes and 12 seconds, apparently, Sherlock was not the only one that could rise from the dead, but we will find out what really happens next in 2016 when Season 4 airs. In Sherlock, more modern developments like the use of computers and hacking are reoccurring symbols of terrorism. Although both adaptations use traditional weapons like bombs and guns, the BBC series do not feel as violent as the Guy Ritchie movies. Even though Moriarty has a widely spread network of terrorists that control the world and still has a rather high death count on his account, he is so powerful because of the use of computerized codes and hacking. Sherlock's style of work is what sets the two characters apart, as his way of using his powers is much more based on the original stories, in which the power of the mind always conquers that of physical violence. Indeed, the attacks that are most successful are the ones based on the use of computerized codes and hacking. 27 in all, the technological advances of the present day or even of the future that are represented in various ways in Sherlock, are to a great extent responsible for what the series have become. The struggle between the real and surreal may add to the series' popularity. However, the non-existence of, for instance, the key code, the hound, and the intelligent glasses, results in an anticlimactic experience. Still, because these high-tech inventions do not exist in real life either, the series also becomes much more plausible while at the same time keeping the audience eager for more. 2.4 Updated themes and characters. The revived and newly found characters of the 2010 series Sherlock all play their significant part in making the series what it has become. Next to the technological advances that were made, the characters were also given a makeover in order to fit in the 21st century world. Some adjustments may be harder to spot than others, but this is maybe so because they were done rather convincingly. In any case, the social life of Sherlock Holmes has broadened, causing his professional and his private life to intertwine at many levels. Still, this does not mean that his life has become any easier, as his social skills are rather underdeveloped, a lack which leads to awkward situations for himself, but also underlines the key strength of the series, namely its comic basis. Next to the series hero, as investigated in Section 1.2, Dr. Watson is the second most important character. Before Sherlock, Martin Freeman was known to the larger audience from his performances in The Office, 2001 to 2003, Love Actually, 2003, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, 2005, and The Hobbit, 2012, and is considered to be one of the most engaging personalities to have emerged in the new century, McFarlane 270. But also in Sherlock he has reinvented himself in the character of Dr. Watson, or, as Brian McFarlane puts it, films should be grateful he gave up squash, an earlier ambition for acting, and in the Sherlock series he was a superb Dr. Watson, 271. There are indeed many ways in which the reinvented Dr. Watson adds to the stories as he has never done before. His character is prominently part of the stories and extends beyond his role of mere storyteller. 28 Martin Freeman's version of Dr. Watson is actually the main character that adds to the series' plausibility. His skeptical mindset makes any extraordinary element that occurs in the episodes plausible by embodying the doubts the audience might have on seemingly impossible situations. One such example is found in the first episode already, in which Dr. Watson and Sherlock meet for the first time. Here, the first instance of Sherlock's method of deduction is demonstrated by his almost flawless description of Watson's past. The introduction of the two characters is rather intense, as Sherlock immediately deduces Watson's background by little hints and clues on his person. Watson is overwhelmed but also intrigued by the figure of Sherlock and does not dismiss the idea of sharing a room together immediately, but does look him up on Google when he gets home. Sherlock eventually explains how he deciphered his background, as shown in section 2.3, and this is not only satisfying for Watson himself but also for the audience. The scene is not only a means to keeping the story realistic but also a fundamental element for gaining constant audience credence. In fact, Watson really is the adult character that Sherlock needs to protect him from himself. Polasek therefore calls him the emotional mediator, 390, of the series, as he constantly tries to rescue Sherlock from awkward social situations. As Watson points out in A Scandal in Belgravia, his blog is Sherlock's living, as it functions as the true source where his clients may contact the consulting detective. Watson chronicles the stories on his blog, thus making sure that the audience is reached and Sherlock's popularity grows. All these elements are the typical job for a present-day personal assistant, one might argue, albeit that the original stories were similarly imagined to have been written down by Watson. Another character which has become much more prominent in the BBC series is Mrs. Hudson, who has a similar role as Dr. Watson regarding the series' realism. At times, Mrs. Hudson expresses the horror and repulsion that the audience might possibly experience in situations such as finding human thumbs in the refrigerator. She is also the most prominent character who repeatedly wonders about what kind of relationship Watson and Sherlock have. The theme of the possible existence of a homosexual relationship between Watson and 29 Holmes is indeed hinted at several times. The first time this occurs is when, upon meeting the two men for the first time, Mrs. Hudson points out there is a second bedroom available, but only if they are needing two bedrooms, 1430. Apart from Mrs. Hudson, women do not play a very prominent role in the private life of Sherlock Holmes. Still, there are two romantic storylines in the series, which is already two more than in the original stories. The most important result of this improvement is the added humane element of the character of Sherlock. Another effect of these female characters is comic relief, as humorous instances are often a result of scenes in which Sherlock converses with women. His first one-sided love interest is lab assistant Molly, who wholeheartedly helps Sherlock whenever he needs her lab for solving cases. At a certain point, she asks him whether he would like to drink some coffee, obviously trying to ask him out, which only results in Sherlock presuming she is going to get him a coffee, to which he answers that he would like 2 sugars. In The Reichenbach Falls, Molly makes a second attempt by telling Sherlock he can always count on her, and uses the rather unfortunate phrase, "You can use me, 38:40. Again, Sherlock's limited social skills prevent him from reaching out to Molly in reciprocation. Still, Molly is the one person who helps him out greatly, thus showing her significance to the plot. For instance, when Sherlock stages his own death, one possible variant of how he has survived shows them being intimate for a few seconds after he crashes through the window of Molly's lab. Sherlock's second romantic interest, Irene Adler, is introduced in A Scandal in Belgravia. Romance plays an obvious role in this episode. The character of Irene Adler is the most convincing argument for Sherlock being a conventional heterosexual. According to Lynn Thomas, Irene expresses herself in terms of a sexually predatory element, 6, in strong contrast to Molly, who represents true romantic yearning, 6. A sexual tension is felt throughout the entire episode, which reaches its climax in the scene in which Sherlock finally succeeds in unlocking her phone, the most important element in her life. This may be read as a symbolic sex act, as Irene Adler's love for Sherlock is eventually key to this episode's case. The correct code to her mobile phone is "I am Sherlock." 30. Irene Adler may be seen as the only female character who takes a stance for her femininity. Still, she does that by using her sexuality against men, which in turn could be read as a negative image. Still, she is so much more than an object of desire, which strengthens the series' concealed feminist message. Sherlock not only deciphers her code, but is also vulnerable in relation to her, as he cannot stop himself from having feelings for her. Sherlock's love life contrasts with Watson's marriage to Mary Morstan. In addition to the above-mentioned relationships with women, Sherlock also pretends to have a relationship with a bridesmaid he knows from John and Mary's wedding. However, this relationship only works as a cover-up in order to get access to Magnuson's office. The only characters that remain solely part of Sherlock's professional life are the police officers, who are not too fond of Holmes interfering in their cases. In particular, Sergeant Sally Donovan repeatedly refers to Sherlock as the freak and, as mentioned before, advises Dr. Watson to keep away from him. Even though the presence of an amateur detective causes trouble for him, Detective Inspector Greg Lestrade needs Sherlock to solve his cases. Overall, Sherlock practically ignores the work of the police force and corrects their mistakes in reasoning. During the press conference in A Study in Pink, Sherlock text messages the word "wrong" to all present journalists every time Lestrade reveals evidence in the case that is apparently false. By underlining the incapability of the police force in contrast to Sherlock's successes, the series have formed Sherlock's identity as the hero and thus most prominent character of the series. 2.5 Conclusion. In all, while the success of the 2010 BBC series Sherlock can be put down to various factors, it is perhaps most admirable for its combination of the digital world with Conan Doyle's presentation of the detective techniques and Holmes' character. The objectives of creators Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat were based on creating an adaptation that would stay very true to the original stories by Arthur Conan Doyle, next to bringing the cases and characters into the 21st century. But by combining the best of both worlds, taking the original 31 stories as a starting point and adding present-day elements to the storyline, the creators were successful in, once again, attracting a very active fan audience for the Sherlock Holmes stories, as will be investigated in Chapter 3. Also, the roles of the characters have changed to such an extent that on the one hand they have stayed true to Conan Doyle's original versions, while at the same time they were being influenced by the creators of the generations. What becomes most evident here is that the role of Sherlock Holmes is still very prominent, while at the same time his social life is broadened by giving other characters more influence. 32 Chapter 3, a 21st Century Fan Base. 3.1 Introduction. The 2010 series Sherlock is easily accessible through Netflix, one of the most successful developments in watching online on-demand series and films of the past couple of years. The international audience is mainly reached via this online platform, and particularly British viewers are encouraged to pursue their Sherlock interest on the BBC website. The BBC website has many features to accommodate for the demand for more Sherlock. There are interactive trailers with exclusive clips from Series 3, a version of John Watson's blog, photo galleries, video interviews with the cast and creators, an extra mini-episode, a clip made by BBC4 on how to be Sherlock Holmes, a puzzle with hidden messages to test your own powers of deduction and help Sherlock Holmes decipher Season 1, a TV blog by Mark Gatiss, a live Q&A with the actors, and much more. Still, the online fan base does not stop at the extra features that are provided by the creators and the BBC. Social media play an even bigger role in the spread of the series' popularity, which is very much in line with the oral popular culture, FISC 319, which is part of present-day online behavior. Of course, there are also certain offline indicators of the series' success. Several award nominations and wins represent the approval of the professional film industry. Next to that, The fact that a new series is going to be released in 2016 shows that the audience, but also the creators, cannot get enough of Sherlock. There are indeed rather influential differences between the offline and online fan communities which also need to be addressed. A qualitative audience investigation is executed here by combining both fan opinions from offline and online sources and expert voices. Next to that, these opinions are put into perspective by my own reading of the series. With the earlier conclusions in mind, it will thus be investigated to what extent Sherlock is part of contemporary British culture and how much of its success was generated by both the BBC and the fan audiences themselves. 33.3.2 Reception of the adaptation. According to the online IMDb database, Sherlock scores an average 9.3 out of 10 as scored by 365.815 users. As the database is a widely respected source for movies and series, it should, therefore, be taken seriously, but it must also be remembered that the users may have varying understandings of quality television. Next to that, the professional world of television have awarded the series with nomination and wins, including BAFTAs, BAFTA Cymru Awards and an Emmy nomination. In all, the series have collected 1 Golden Globe nomination, 166 awards and has nominated for another 100 prizes. But apart from the professional approval, the fan audience has also shown its dedication to the series through various media. Like the cynical character Anderson, a member of the police force with Delest Raid but foremost a Sherlock critic, some fans tend to become obsessed by the theories of how Sherlock died in Episode 2, Season 3. The first episode of Season 3 already gives a few options which are underlined with visual evidence, but what really happened with Moriarty and Sherlock during the rooftop scene does not become entirely clear. Anderson himself parallels the late 19th century audience that demanded Conan Doyle should resurrect Sherlock from the dead, as he is convinced that Sherlock still has to be alive. This discussion is subject to many online fan communities as well, but on platforms like these there is also an enormous amount of information to be found on the reception of the BBC adaptation as such. In many ways, Sherlock may be compared to the 1980s popular series Morse, which is obviously also an English detective story but is more interesting as a comparison here because of its status as quality television. The gender representation in the Sherlock's audience is not as extreme as in the romantic Morse series, as there are little instances of romantic narratives. As this is a typical development of the 21st century, one could use the term post-feminist as Lynn Thomas does to describe changes in the audiences of contemporary popular culture, too. Sherlock does not belong to a women's genre, 5, as the audience does not only consist of the typical screaming female fans, although there are of course some of that type. As with Morse, Sherlock only has a few female characters and 34 female individuals with the production team. This may also indicate that the producers chose to have a broader focus in order for the series to attract a more diverse audience. According to Fisk, one methodological strategy of cultural studies derives from ethnography, 305, an approach that helps with the study of the meaning of fan expressions. One element of this strategy, which is reading comments on fan pages, is used for this investigation in particular. Alongside this investigation, an analysis of social media use and Sherlock's online identity is also provided for in Section 3.3. It has to be taken into account that in this context meanings are relative and change according to historical and social conditions, Fisk 305, and thus need to be seen in the light of 21st century British society, hence the focus on online fan environments. Also offline fan bases still exist, such as the Baker Street Irregulars that have been around since 1934. The Sherlock Holmes Society of London was founded in 1951, but when the Sherlock series came out the amount of viewers and subscribers soared. Apart from this interesting fact, the offline platforms will not be part of this investigation, as the focus lies on online communities, social media use and other online components. The online fans of the BBC series are mainly found on social media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook. Next to that, These fans also voice their opinions on separate fan sites and in comment boxes on sites like IMDb. A source which shows and tells the direct responses on the series' popularity are clips of videos found on YouTube, which are an example of the active fan response towards the series. The most important source for giving an understanding of the reception of the 2010 BBC adaptation is indeed found on YouTube, namely a video of the Great Holmes debate. In 2011, a focus group-like investigation, called the Great Sherlock Holmes Debate, was held in London. It compared the latest Sherlock Holmes adaptations as produced by the BBC and Warner Brothers. The debate was accessible online and its audience could vote twice for the best adaptation of the original tale, before the debate was aired and after they had heard the evidence as provided by the Holmes scholars, members of Sherlock Holmes societies, and webmasters of fan sites. These so-called Holmes experts debated on what the current 35 productions of the Holmes name contributed to the legacy of Sherlock Holmes, FOD. The BBC series fans actively engaged whereas the Warner Brothers fans did not, even though initiators of the debate had spread their research at various platforms. A few of the debate's outcomes that might explain why the Sherlock series are so successful will be addressed here. First of all, according to the experts, the sinister Moriarty was enjoyable as his character addressed the childlike playfulness which Plasek already identified in Sherlock's character as described in section 1.2. The character of Moriarty has indeed become very important, as there is a need for somebody to challenge the hero and Moriarty was in fact the only one that was able to do so. Apart from Andrew Scott, Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman were both also thought to have delivered great performances. Next to that, the experts appreciated the fact that the series had stayed very true to the canon. Above all, they thought that the location was the real strength of the series as one may actually visit the settings in London, an activity which many fans undertake. But more importantly, the series give a new dimension to the original tales. The true importance of the series indeed lies beyond the episodes and adds to the legacy in that it gets people to engage with the original stories. One difficulty that comes with investigating online fan audiences is the fact that their platforms are truly international, resulting in the inability to point out the British society. In her article Identity and the Online Media Fan Community, Faith Lawrence points out that people like to interact regardless of the medium they are using. The online media fan, OMF, communities, as she calls them, are platforms where people interact with other fans with a shared interest. The majority of these communities are made up of TV and film audiences like the ones that are subject to this thesis. The users' activities include discussion and analysis of the shared object of interest, Lawrence 233, and other creative activities such as art/image manipulation, video editing and setting up and maintaining online environments/archives, 233 to 234. All these activities are indeed found in relation to fan audience activity on OMF communities of fans of the series Sherlock, as will be explored further in section 3.3. 36 in all, the character of Sherlock Holmes may again be as popular as he was in the late 19th century, and likely in part because of the BBC series Sherlock and its online representation, that popularity has spread internationally. Still, it must be noted here that although the audience shows the series' popularity, the commercial success gives a whole different dimension to this popularity. Next to the BBC, also fan clubs and fan platforms have created a market for merchandise and for more online content. According to Peter Haining, Sherlock Holmes' place in popular culture is the foundation for his resurgence in popularity. 5. Haining also concluded that when the stories of Sherlock Holmes were rewritten for the medium of television, it soon proved to be just one further step in the development of the legend of Sherlock Holmes. 43. In line with Haining's argument, the conclusion may be drawn that the medium of internet has added yet another dimension to the experience of Sherlock Holmes, but also to its character, whose identity was also developed online, as will be discussed hereafter. Like the original stories, the series have evidently become a commercial success and are exploited, but what is more interesting are the people behind these numbers and figures. By giving an overview of all fan domains in the next section, the impact that the 21st century Sherlock series have had on its audience and vice versa becomes evident. 3.3 Online identity. For years, fans were regarded as simply people with poor social skills, poor too, a definition which ironically could also have worked for the character of Sherlock himself. Benjamin Poore even suggests that Sherlock Holmes fandom has developed some of the characteristics of institutionalist religion, too, which to a certain extent may indeed be the case, as some fans are very dedicated in their admiration of their detective hero. Still, this parallel may not do justice to the capabilities of fan groups as such. As Alan McKee points out, a fan audience should be acknowledged for their productive abilities, 168, rather than seeing them only as consumers. Exactly because of the production and use of online platforms, Sherlock has become a digital native, Haining 43, with his corresponding online identity. Undoubtedly, mainly Benedict Cumberbatch has been getting a lot of attention since 37 his performances, but his popularity has also grown to a large extent because of his online identity. There are various Twitter accounts which are used to spread news on the BBC series as well as on Benedict Cumberbatch himself. The Twitter account at Cumberbitches, 209k followers, describes itself as the most glorious and elusive society for the appreciation of the high cheekboned, blue-eyed sex bomb that is Benedict Timothy Carlton Cumberbatch. Another comparable account, which goes by the name at Bakerst Babes, focuses more on the series as a whole and claims to be the web's only all-female Sherlock Holmes podcast. There is also the Cumberbatch Forum, cumberbatchforum.tumblr.com, on which fans express their feelings about the series, but mainly regarding the lead actor. Next to these Twitter accounts which were created by fans of the series, the use of Twitter by Irene Adler in Sherlock and its audience's reaction in real life is of interest as well. Ms. Adler has her own professional Twitter account in the series called The Whip Hand. At present day, several Twitter accounts exist under her name or her nickname, created by either fans of the series or women that perform the same job as Mrs. Adler who use her fame for their own businesses. The most successful of these is at the _whip_hand with a large amount of followers, 44,8k, and tweets, 54,6k, that underlines it is a parody #Sherlock account. Not run by the BBC. All Sherlock-related Twitter accounts mainly contain quotes from the series that fans particularly liked and discussions about the arrival of new episodes, although the ones related to Irene Adler mostly have sexually related hints in them. Surprisingly, the official BBC Twitter at the Whip Hand has many followers, 9,765, but posted only 13 tweets, a very meager amount compared to the unofficial at the _whip_hand. The marketing strategy of the BBC is thus to be found elsewhere. Apart from these specialized Twitter accounts, there are also Facebook pages which dedicate their content on the Sherlock series and are even more successful. The official BBC page has a staggering 4.8 million likes and is the ultimate proof of the marketing success of Sherlock. The page carries advertisements for the BBC shop, where many products are sold, from t-shirts to necklaces and posters. Another social media platform which shows the series' commercial success is Pinterest, on which various boards are created by users which 38 mainly collect humorous material made by fans. Here, it is evident that many kinds of companies are trying to get attention from the series fans as well, as American news feed website BuzzFeed and music channel MTV have posts with titles like 16 times Benedict Cumberbatch was the world's sexiest Sherlock. Therefore the question rises to what extent the success of the series depends on an spontaneous but active fan audience and how much is the result of marketing. The answer may actually be found on the official Sherlock-related websites. Next to social media sites, seemingly independent websites like SherlockOlogy.com, the ultimate guide for any BBC Sherlock fan, are platforms which gather all sorts of information, both from social media, and from other online sources. Still, such platforms are mostly updated through social media use, and the best way to keep up with the newest articles is again by following them on Twitter, 309k followers, and Facebook, 815.309 likes. Another such platform is thescienceofdeduction.co.uk, a site which is said to be maintained by Sherlock Holmes himself, including him writing blogs and asking for help from his audience with solving his cases. This site is part of a series of websites, including johnwatsonblog.co.uk, mollyhooper.co.uk, and connieprince.co.uk, which are all created by television writer Joseph Lidster, as commissioned by the BBC. As is stated on the BBC site, these websites are all entirely fictional and form part of the fictional world of Sherlock Holmes, BBC. As stated above, SherlockOlogy.com appears to be independent as it is not listed on the BBC website as official Sherlock character sites, but at the bottom of the page it states Hartswood Films Limited, the company that produces Sherlock for the BBC. Also on YouTube, various fans have created channels which contain clips from the series itself, but also interviews with the actors. Mostly, these fans create the videos for private use as a means of showing their interest in the series, but these amateur video producers reach enormous audience sizes between 40.000 and 250.000 viewers. Here, clips of the episodes with a shared subject are mainly combined with music with apt lyrics which may come across as amateuristic. Overall, these videos come across as typical fan productions but are sometimes made quite cleverly. As may be concluded from the amount of 39 viewers, their reach is widespread, which makes these fan expressions rather influential as part of fan audience communication as well. Still, there are also other online platforms that add to the spread of popularity even more. One such community is 9gag, an online accessible site with its own application that assembles memes. Benedict Cumberbatch, like Martin Freeman and Andrew Scott, is part of his own meme generation, which entails that a certain picture is used over and over again but with different texts. Memes and the study of them, called memetics, was introduced in 1976 already by Richard Dawkins, as he compared them to genes in his book The Selfish Gene. For a more suitable present-day definition applicable to internet memes specifically, I refer to Patrick Davison, who wrote that an internet meme is a piece of culture, typically a joke, which gains influence through online transmission. 122. Memes are spread via platforms that are specialized in assembling these kind of image manipulations, Lawrence 233, but the images are more likely to be tested among fan communities first where they are also created. The memes usually consists of a picture of the subject, in this case Benedict Cumberbatch, with a text that invokes amusement. Memes are definitely part of our Web 2.0 generation, one that is created by interactive users of the internet. On platforms like these also people who are not particularly interested in the series are active, which may result in memes being incomprehensible for that particular audience. With all the online success, one may wonder how the beloved actor responds to this all. In an interview with New York Magazine, he states, "I flirt with it, I have fun with it." As a response to his fans who like to call themselves Cumberbitches, he suggested they should change their name into Cumberbabes, making the community more feminist approved, or even better, Cumber Collective. Cumberbatch's success has indeed soared after his appearance as the most well-known detective of all time, and he has shown himself to be an excellent actor in many succeeding films such as The Imitation Game and August, Osage County. His individual success as an actor thus also affects the popularity and our understanding of all the characters he plays, including Sherlock Holmes. In analyzing the online identity of Sherlock, it is, therefore, crucial but also very difficult to make a distinction 40 between the two personas. The image of Cumberbatch has become inextricably associated with the 21st century variant of Sherlock Holmes, an identity which has spread through the enormous reach of the internet. 3.4 Conclusion: in all, there are numerous ways in which fandom may be expressed on the internet. Apart from services as provided by the BBC network itself, there are also very lively fan communities online. The latter is most interestingly here, as it shows the power of online fan communities, while the former is also successful at particular social media platforms but only because of its commercial approach. The fan audience is to be found on both social media, forums, specialized websites, and even meme platforms. The importance of these fan communities cannot be underestimated and lies mainly in that they are in a large part responsible for the spread of Sherlock's success. As such, the internet and its online audience have given the phenomenon of Sherlock Holmes a new dimension. It seems as if the only way that the fan audience is kept alive is by feeding them new information, both from the series itself and by adding merchandise to the already extensive supplies. Both elements seem highly successful in doing so, although the audience is very demanding in the arrival of new episodes as well. The question rises whether the series in itself is still enough for such a demanding public, which is to a large extent responsible for the enormous online spread and demand as well. The principle of convergence shows that the series have outgrown the creator's original intention of mere entertainment into an almost inconceivable phenomenon. Until the release of the new season, the fan audience will presumably be producing and sharing more and more information on any detail they might find interesting enough to discuss. 41 Conclusion. In future, fanfiction and adaptations are two options for further development of the Sherlock empire. As Poore argues, the original Victorian age stories written by Conan Doyle will eventually become too distant from our contemporary understanding, as indeed it is our distance from the world of Holmes that creates the imaginative seed for adaptation. 13. The BBC series Sherlock has provided that our generation has its own version of Sherlock Holmes, who from various points of view may be regarded as a contemporary figure. The fact that so many different adaptations are made even at present day underlines that the original stories are far from exhausted and are still read today, albeit as a result of growing enthusiasm through these new variants. The creators of Sherlock, Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat, were not only great fans of Conan Doyle's work but were even inspired by the tales to such an extent that they wanted to create their own adaptation. Because of the success of the BBC series, the original stories also saw a surge in popularity, a development which, quite paradoxically in relation to the Poore's above-mentioned argument, underlines the survival of Conan Doyle's work as such. Not only the professional world of television critics and professionals have recognized Sherlock as quality television, but that the fan audience was convinced of its quality as well. The audience has an excessive share in the spread of the series, resulting in Sherlock to become a global success during the past couple of years. Indeed, the most evident conclusion that may be drawn from various elements investigated in this thesis, is that evidence for the audience's enthusiasm about the series is mainly to be found online. The reinvention of the character of Sherlock Holmes for this generation was done extremely successfully, not least because of the initial fandom of its creators Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat. They have not only stayed true to the original stories as written by Arthur Conan Doyle, but have also quite cleverly used their experience as producers to create a humorous adaptation which also contains all possible technological gadgets of the 21st century. The technological developments have indeed altered many elements of the series. For instance, they transformed the nature of the famous Holmesian method, as Sherlock now solves cases by 42. Obtaining information via duct weather applications on his smartphone. Next to that, they have created an online environment that has changed the relationship of fans with the phenomenon of Sherlock Holmes into a much more active one. But also the series have already instigated a more active attitude from its audience by giving them hints and clues by projecting them on screen. Next to that, the BBC being a deep-rooted institution in British society and Sherlock Holmes being a cultural phenomenon also adds to the series' reputation, which has aided to its success. At the same time, the broadcasting network uses the series' fame in such a way that the audience is not only satisfied with commercial merchandise but is also triggered to long for new episodes at the same time. It will be interesting to see whether the much anticipated new episodes will meet their expectations or whether even such talented producers and inspiring actors have exhausted their possibilities. We do know for a fact that the BBC series Sherlock could never have been this popular if it weren't for the interactive platforms used extensively by its fan audience. Not only the producers were great fans of the original stories, also the 21st century audience was still intrigued by the what remained at heart old cases. This fan enthusiasm has, together with the unlimited possibilities of the internet, resulted in a dynamic combination that has resulted in Sherlock's success. The decline of the literary culture as such is one development of our present-day society, something which has been quickened by the growing accessibility of the internet. Series like Sherlock may be a positive development for a new take on literature. Similarly, one has to keep in mind that series like Sherlock would never have existed if the creators weren't such great fans of the original Conan Doyle stories in the first place. The audience's demand for a new season of Sherlock is tremendous, and it seems as if they need it like a true addiction. But before new episodes will come out, a special edition has been announced to air in December of this year. The clip that was shown with the announcement makes sure that the audience is triggered for new Sherlock material, but asks yet again for its audience patience. Interestingly enough though, the clip shows 221B Baker Street in a Victorian setting, which raises the question whether the modern Sherlock will be 43 exchanged for its most original adaptation after all. Still, it is for sure that the series have not been exhausted at all at this point, and new material will only add to the series' popularity and fan-made material. 44 works cited as scandal in Belgravia. Sherlock. BBC. London. January 1, 2012. A Study in Pink. Sherlock. BBC. London. July 25, 2010. Auden, Wystan Hugh. The Guilty Vicarage. The Dyer's Hand. Faber and Faber, London, 1948. Pages 146 to 158. BBC site. LTHTTP//www.bbc.co.uk/program/b03pzpgy/liveegweb. May 4, 2015. BBC site. LTHTTP://www.bbc.co.uk/program/articles/4YTRVL4SRK48MKS8BHK4TVM. Other Sherlock related websites. Web. July 12, 2015. Benjamin, Walter. The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Modernism, an Anthology of Sources and Documents. Eds Kolokotranai, Vasiliki and Goldman, Jane and Taxidou, Olga. Edinburgh University Press, 1998. Pages 570 to 576. Blumler, J.G. British Television in Encyclopedia of Television. Volume 1. Fitzroy Dearborn, New York, 1997, 2nd edition, 2004. Pages 330 to 337. Brunsdon, Charlotte. Structure of Anxiety, Recent British Television Crime Fiction. Screen, Volume 39, Issue 3. Pages 223 to 243. Collins, Jim. Television and Postmodernism. Channels of Discourse, Reassembled, Television and Contemporary Criticism. Robert C. Allen, ed. Routledge, London, 1992. Pages 327 to 349. Cook, Les. British Television Drama, A History. British Film Institute, 2003. Creeber, Glenn. The Television Genre Book. British Film Institute, 2008. Davison, Patrick. The Language of Internet Memes. The Social Media Reader. Ed Michael Mundyberg. New York University, 2012. Pages 120 to 134. Doyle, Arthur Conan. The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, 1892, Penguin Classics 2001. Fisk, John. British Cultural Studies and Television. Channels of Discourse, Reassembled, Television and Contemporary Criticism. Robert C. Allen, ed. London, Routledge, 1992. Pages 284 to 326. Fisk, John. Television Culture. Routledge, London, 1987. 45 Fode, Ross K. The Great Sherlock Holmes Debate 3 full length. Online video clip. YouTube. September 8, 2012. Web. June 21, 2015. Gensler, Lauren. Netflix soars on subscribers growth. http://www.forbes.com/site/Lauren Gensler/2015/01/20/ Netflix soars on subscriber growth /GT Web. May 28, 2015. Gib Ehrman, Susan R. Sherlock Holmes. Encyclopedia of Television. Volume 4. Fitzroy Dearborn, New York, 1997, 2nd edition, 2004. Haining, Peter, Rev. ed. The Television Sherlock Holmes. Virgin Books, London, 1991. His Last Vow. Sherlock. BBC. London. January 12, 2014. Jameson, Frederick. Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. Duke University Press, 1991. Jenkins, Henry. Convergence Culture, Where Old and New Media Collide. New York Up, 2006. IMDb. Sherlock LT http://www.imdb.com/title/TT1475582/GT Web. May 4, 2015. Lawrence, K. Faith. Identity and the Online Media Fan Community. Digital Identity and Social Media. Stephen Warburton and Stylianos Hatzapanagas, eds. IGI Global, 2013. Pages 233 to 255. McFarlane, Brian ed., and Slide, Anthony S. ed. The Encyclopedia of British Film, Manchester University Press, 4th edition, 2013. McKee, Alan. How to Tell the Difference Between Production and Consumption, a Case Study in Doctor Who Fandom. Cult Television. Gwenllian Jones, S. and Pearson, M., eds. University of Minnesota Press, 2004. Pages 167 to 185. Nicole, Bran. Adapting Doyle in the 21st Century. Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle, Multimedia Afterlives. Sabine Van Acker and Catherine Wynne, eds. Palgrave Macmillan, 2013. Pages 124 to 139. Oxford Dictionary of National Bibliography. Lord Reith LT http://www.oxforddnb.com/view/article/31596 doc pos =1 GT Web. June 21, 2015. Oxford Dictionary of National Bibliography. Sir Robert Graham Stevens LT. 46 http://www.oxford.com as proxy.leidenunav.nl 2048/view/article/60387, doc pos =2 GT Web. June 21, 2015. Payneck, Leroy. After Sherlock Holmes, The Evolution of British and American Detective Stories 1891 to 1914. McFarland and Company Incorporated Publishers, 2014. Polasek, Ashley D. Surveying the Post-Millennial Sherlock Holmes, A Case for the Great Detectives as a Man of Our Times. Oxford Journals, Arts and Humanities, Adaptation. Volume 6, Issue 3. pages 384 to 393. Routley, Eric. The Puritan Pleasures of the Detective Story, Victor Gollancz Limited, London, 1972. The Blind Banker. Sherlock. BBC. London. August 1, 2010. The Empty Hearse. Sherlock. BBC. London. January 1, 2014. The Great Game. Sherlock. BBC. London. August 8, 2010. The Hounds of Baskerville. Sherlock. BBC. London. January 8, 2012. The Reichenbach Fall. Sherlock. BBC. London. January 15, 2012. The Sign of Three. Sherlock. BBC. London. January 5, 2014. Thomas, Lynn. In Love with Inspector Morse, Feminist Subculture and Quality Television. Feminist Review. Issue 51. Pages 1 to 25. Unlocking Sherlock LT https://vimeo.com/826194000 GT June 21 Midnight Oil production in association with Hartswood Films for BBC Worldwide and PBS. January 12, 2014. Vulture. Benedict and the Cumberbitches, What Fame Looks Like from Inside a Mem LT http://www.vulture.com/2014/11/ What Fame Looks Like for Benedict Cumberbatch. HTML GT. Web. June 21, 2015.